So anyway, thank you for having me and welcoming me to New England Yearly Meeting. I'm jealous of your, even though you've had hail and so on, your temperature, I'm sure, is much more enjoyable than ours right now in Houston. But and I'm glad to have this conversation about having successful conversations. And I'd like to start by by asking you all just a quick go around of what comes to mind for you all when you have conversations, if you do, on this subject with others. Maybe just sort of popcorn, no more than a sentence each.
And friends on Zoom, you're welcome to pop in.
I feel nervous.
Thank you, Molly.
Starting out with an easy subject to talk about.
Yeah.
Wanting to be supportive of my Jewish friends, but having that conflict.
Thank you, Alma.
Wanting to be invitational and not step on a landmine right off the bat.
Yes.
Sadly willing to avoid it completely.
Yeah. And so my goal today, I'm sorry?
Nothing.
Someone I thought.
Tend to avoid discussion with Jewish friends.
Yeah. So, so thank you for sharing that. I've been in situations of all of those situations before, and I'm sure you all have been in situations that the others have shared as well. And so my goal today is I'm going to share now my presentation. And my goal today is, let me see if I can get it to work here, is to explain why we need to have these conversations, as difficult as they are. And I'm going to suggest who to have these conversations with. And then finally, how to make those conversations productive. And we can define that a little bit later. But this may sound rather strange, but my goal is to help you have enjoyable and connecting and transformational conversations with your friends who may have differing views than you. So let's get started with that. I can see my screen here. I've got to reorganize it a little bit. There we go. All right. So there are different kinds of conversations to have on Israel-Palestine, and what we're going to focus on tonight is one-on-one conversations. And that is conversations that you're going to have with a friend or an acquaintance. And this is different than if you were talking, for example, with a group. In a group environment, let's say you're on a panel or where you're speaking to another panelist, or you're being interviewed and so on, and there's an audience, you're really probably speaking to the audience in that situation, even though it looks like you're speaking to this person who's interviewing you or that you're on the panel with. So, so I think it's important that we're conscious of that as we're having these conversations, that who we're speaking with or to. The pace of conversation is also different in a group one. Usually there's a schedule, like an hour, and you have to get all of the points in and so on. So whereas on a one-on-one, often my recommendation is one of the goals is to set it up so that you can have a follow-on conversation. The goal is really to have a follow-on conversation because this is such a deep subject and so emotional for so many people. What I find is that I want to get a certain place, but I want to set it up for a future conversation. That's very different than in a group environment. And then finally, in a group environment, I often want to share facts and things of that nature. But in the interesting thing about Israel-Palestine, in a one-on-one conversation, often the facts aren't as important as the stories that we each hold and understanding how to work with those stories. So we're going to get into it, but I just wanted to at least start off by saying we're going to focus this on one-on-one conversations, but to give you at least a glimpse of what's different in a group type environment. So typically when we are told about Israel-Palestine, it's framed as if there are two major perspectives, sort of a Zionist perspective and a Palestinian perspective. And just for clarity, I'm defining Zionism here as sort of an ethno-religious movement for a Jewish state, a supremacist state, a state where the Jews run, are in control. And so, and a lot of people conflate Zionism with Judaism or being Jewish. And I think it's really important to distinguish the two because Zionism is a national movement, a nationalist movement, whereas being Jewish is an identity, whether it's ethnic or religious. So anyway, in going back, so we have these two perspectives that we're told is sort of the narrative. And because there are these two perspectives, we're led to believe that the way to have conversations is to argue one against the other. If we look closely, though, at the Zionist perspective, a lot of it is based on sort of the concepts of, for example, that since its inception, Israel has continuously been on the defensive. I'm sure you all have heard that before, that the land Israel controls was given exclusively to the Jews by God or the UN or both. That the Middle East conflict is because Arabs have always hated Jews, and that Israel wants peace, but it's the Palestinians and Arabs who are continuously the aggressors. That goes back to the defensive argument. And the problem is that the reality, oops, my slides aren't advancing. Here we go. The problem is there's some problems with these basic narratives. So for example, on the first one, Israel claims to be always on the defensive, but it controls land that it's taken from its neighbors by force. So the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and Gaza from Egypt. And it still will not let refugees return. So that's hard to argue that that's defensive, but nonetheless, that narrative continues. Similarly, the land Israel controls, whether it's given by God or the UN, obviously many people interpret Holy Scripture differently, whether it's the Bible. Obviously not all Jews agree with that interpretation. Clearly not all Christians do. And obviously all Muslims don't. And, what about Hindus and Buddhists and so on? So it's a selective group that has that belief. And similarly, if the UN, on the UN, it's important to know that the UN partition plan, which was adopted by Resolution 181 in 1947, was never adopted. The borders were not, and the requirements that equality among ethnic groups within the countries was never implemented. The Middle East conflict, being that the parties hate each other, is problematic because Jews and Arabs have lived together for millennia, not just in historic Palestine, but for example, Northern Africa and other parts of the Middle East. So it's really the conflict as such, if you call it that, has really been in the last 100 years. And then finally, the claim that Israel always wants peace is difficult when Israel continuously discriminates and occupies Palestinians and, cleanses the land and replaces them with settlements. So the point is that the story that we hear from a Zionist perspective doesn't add up. And so the two realities is that one is really not there. It's a mythical illusion. And how does that happen? It happens through language. The reason that we believe these stories that, these 4 bullets, for example, is because of the language that's used to support them. And what kind of language is that? Well, we're told that the only democracy in the Middle East is Israel, that, people who support security and Judeo-Christian values and peace, are support Israel, while those while they also want to fight terrorism and hatred, right? So that's sort of the argument that's used to support Israel. But the problem is it's actually the opposite. It's not a democracy because Palestinians don't have citizenship for the most part. It's not secure. It's not secure. Obviously, what we've seen from October 7th and beyond is not a safe place for either group. And we hope that the Judeo-Christian values are not to oppress and to discriminate. And obviously, those things don't lead to peace. So it's really the opposite of the language, and it's just the use of the language that's problematic. So in the case of, I call it Israel speak, when they use the term defensive to refer to Israel, what they're really talking about is supporting taking land by force and oppressing and violating human rights. When they talk about democracy, it's about denying self-determination for all people on their land. And the return, again, is not allowing the people who've lived there for centuries, if not millennia, the right to return, and so on. So the point is, it's the use of language. The vocabulary is designed to hide, unfortunately, the racism that's inherent in Zionism. Zionism, again, is an ethno-religious nationalist movement for supremacy of that group over another in the land that historically has also been lived in by other ethnic groups. So why do we care about this? Why am I even spending time and you all even here? I think it's important because, as we know, people are dying and being oppressed. And I wrote this before a year ago. So people were dying then as well. Because the messaging that Zionism has to be deceptive to be acceptable. If everybody could see it clearly as a racist nationalist movement, as many we have seen before, including in the United States against the Native Americans, then it has to hide that racism to be acceptable. And so I think what's important in our conversations is that we do it in a way that's careful, that's considerate of others, but that still brings it to the forefront. I'm in this also because I want to stand for human rights, for the testimonies of peace, equality, integrity, and very importantly, the United States is extremely complicit in the situation, so that as an American, I feel very responsible for the violations of human rights. All right. So we have a responsibility, and so what do we do? How do we change the situation? In Israel, they could change it from their, within their society or politicians. But we've seen an extremist government, and many supporting the aggression that's going on. And again, this presentation was done before October 7th, so we've just seen that heightened. And in the United States, Canada, and Europe, the problem is, politicians, very few have stood for ceasefire, for example, and for ending the violence and discrimination. So the problem is the ball is in our court for change to occur. And how do we do that? We do that with conversations. And we do it not just with our friends who may agree with us, but we have to have conversations with people who disagree with us. Now, that doesn't mean we have conversations with everyone who disagrees with us. We want to have conversations with people who are honest and not intending to deceive, because there are people who out there who are promoting the Zionist agenda because they're intentionally deceiving. They know it's misleading. However, many, if not the most, of Zionists that I've run into are not intending to deceive. They just believe the stories. And so that's who I target, okay? And I think it's important to find people who oppose racism, because if they don't oppose racism, then there's nothing wrong with Zionism. And so the key is identifying people who oppose, all forms of racism. So, and again, why do this? It's because I think it's the bottoms up is going to have the ultimate change and bring peace there. Okay, so who to talk to? Here's sort of a diagram. There are those who believe in the myth over here, and there's who intentionally deceive. I don't spend any time on those who intentionally deceive, okay? My highest priority is people here on the right, those who stand for equality, those who stand for human rights, those who stand for freedom, and then sometimes who are concerned about our foreign aid and taxes being used against these values. To me, that's the sweet spot, okay? Those are where I can have the most fruitful conversations. The next is Jewish Zionists. And the reason is so many of my Jewish friends and acquaintances clearly have been raised, from my learning from them, with a very heightened sensitivity to anti-Jewish discrimination. And so that racism to them is, they're very sensitive to racism. And when they see, if I can turn the mirror just slightly so that they see the racism that's inherent in Zionism, it offers openings. And I'll give you a little story. I had a conversation. I met this rabbi through an ACLU Lunch and Learn, where we were talking about activism we're involved with. And I mentioned in that I did a lot with Israel-Palestine activism. And he said, "Oh, I'd love to talk with you sometime about that." And so we set up our separate meeting, and we did a little intro. And during then he proceeded to share with me for about 10 minutes why he thought that Jews ought to have preferential treatment in Israel. And at the end, and he included things that I knew from my research and my books that were factually incorrect. But nonetheless, I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. And at the end, I thanked him for sharing, and said, and I told him that I had heard his perspective. I think I understand it. But as a Quaker who stands by the testimony of equality, I couldn't support it. And I told him, I said, and I'm actually looking for Jews in Houston to work with who stand for equality. And I said, do you know any? And there was silence. And then he said, no, I don't. And I said, well, I hope that if you run across any, that you will give them my contact information, because again, I'd really like to work with Jews against this. But the point is, if I had asked him a half an hour before if he discriminated against anybody, I'm sure he would have said no. You know, because Jews have a long history of working against racism, the civil rights movement, etc. But we're all in bubbles. I'm in a bubble. Each of us is in our own bubble. And part of the bubble that this rabbi was in was not seeing that he was opposing equality when it came to Israel. And so when I can have conversations like that with people like that rabbi, it's loving, it's considerate, it's listening, but it may provide an opening. I've not heard from him since, but I suspect that he saw something through our conversation that he had not seen before. The final group is the Christian Zionists, and frankly, they're the hardest of these three. And the reason is they don't have the same anti-racism emphasis in the culture of Christian Zionists that the Jewish Zionists have. And so it's a little bit more difficult conversation, but what I try to do there is ask them about, what's the golden rule mean to you, and how does the whole end time story fit with the golden rule, and if they believe in that, then is the God that they're choosing to believe in, and I use that language, I think it's important to use, because religion and faith is a choice. So I asked, why do they choose to believe in a God who is racist, who gives preferential treatment to one ethnic group at the expense of another? And so just to ask them, not in an accusatory way, but in a trying to understand way. So anyway, those are the groups that I go after in that order. And these are the group, and the bottom are the ones I avoid. All right. I'm taking a little bit too much time. Let me sort of pick it up here. So what do? We set the groundwork for multiple conversations. I mentioned this earlier. We're not going to make a whole lot of progress in one conversation. So the goal is get a second conversation. The next thing is it's important to form a community of support. Many Zionists that I've gotten to know have a lot of their identity tied in with Israel, especially Jewish Zionists. They've been raised in an environment where they associate themselves with Israel. Our yearly meeting is actually held at a Jewish summer camp, Easter weekend every year. And it's really interesting to walk around the camp because, for example, all the dorms have cities, Israeli cities. They're named after Israeli cities. And you walk into one of the largest rooms, and the old city is right there in the middle, and then the continents of the world are painted on the walls around it. But it's clear that the messaging is, that these kids who come there to summer camp are connected with Israel. So when they start realizing that this mythology that they've been raised to believe of this safe place, of this democracy, of Western values, of human rights and so on, when they start seeing it fall apart, when they are able to address it, they start to lose friends. They start to lose family members. Their community starts to fall apart. So it's really important that when we have conversations with them, that as we build these multiple conversations, that we are there for them in a loving way to support them so that they have community, so that they're not alone when they go through this. One thing that is really important is we're not going to get anywhere by accusing anybody of anything. But because their story doesn't add up, I like to, the exercise that I use for myself is to continuously ask myself, how was this person convinced of the story? And so I use my curiosity, and that keeps them engaged and keeps me engaged. So I encourage you all to do that. And the reason that it keeps them engaged is because the more I'm interested in listening to their story and ask questions about their story, the more they think they can convince me. And that keeps them interested in convincing me in their story. And that the fact that they think they can win. They think, as I showed you those two, the Venn diagram, they're coming from the perspective of it's my view versus your view. And they don't realize that often their view doesn't hold water. And so I'm willing to let them, think they can win. And, if they convince me of something, good for them. I just haven't been to this date, and so on. All right, so how do we engage? It's not a debate. It's not trying to win. We do not convince them. They end up convincing themselves. That rabbi, I didn't tell him he was wrong. All right, but I think he learned something about his perspective, and he's the one who taught him that, not me. And then I need to be there for them in their stages of grieving. When I don't know about you all, but I was raised, I was not raised Quaker. And when I was raised, I was told about Santa Claus. You all taught about Santa Claus? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I still remember when I learned that Santa Claus was not real. It was in grade school, and it was from a classmate. And because my parents had told me that Santa Claus was real, I trusted my parents. And so it had to be real. But then when the kid, tells me, well, then how do you get a fat guy to come down a chimney? And I had to realize, wait a minute, this story doesn't make sense, and but then I had to grieve the fact that my parents had lied to me, right? But for the situation for especially Zionist Jews, it's orders of magnitude worse, because it's not just some guy who's passes through one night a year, right? This is their identity. It's far more significant. So anyway, that's why the grieving is such an important part in these conversations. All right. How do we have these conversations? By listening, by asking questions, and by holding them to their story. So they're going to tell you things, and we just need to ask, well, how does it make sense? Here's what I don't understand. You call it a democracy, but most of the indigenous people aren't allowed to vote. What's democratic about that? I just want to understand, etc. What I don't want to do is give them a lot of facts, because what will happen in those, and you all have probably faced this as well, is one side pulls out their facts and the other side pulls out their facts, and you get nowhere. So I only give some facts which are missing in their story. So for example, I was in a senator's office, Senator Grassley, and I was talking to a person at the desk there, and we were talking about the West Bank, and he said, and he started, when I talked about the occupation, he rolled his eyes, and I said, well, what's the issue with the occupation? He said, well, it's not a military occupation, it's disputed territory. And I said, okay, if it's disputed territory, why is it that Palestinians living there are under military law and Jews who are there are under civilian law? And he said, well, I don't know. And so the point is, that's one fact that I brought out as a question. Notice I didn't tell him that he's wrong. I just asked him for clarification because of that story didn't add up. All right. We approach this with genuine curiosity, non-judgmentally, firmly, with love and care. Okay. Be sensitive to where they are in their journey. So some are further down that journey, others are way at the beginning. So, and again, as I mentioned, for many, we're holding their hand in a traumatic journey. And it boils down to values. And we're going to help them identify them as we get clarity in our own. All right. So how do we start these conversations? As we shared at the beginning of this, often we try to avoid them. So I let everyone know that I'm an activist on Israel-Palestine. And that sort of, that turns some people, like, they don't want to have a conversation about it with me, but others will say, oh, that's interesting. You know, tell me more. But that's a way to get the conversation going. I have a group that meets regularly, and in fact, we're meeting next week. We meet the first Wednesday of every month. That is actually mostly Jewish, a couple Palestinians, and then a few others that are like me, Quakers and a Presbyterian and so on. And this, I call this my lab. It's where I practice different techniques, where I see how folks respond to different things, different messaging and so on. But it's a safe environment for all. And it's very structured. And so if you'll ever want to set up something like this, reach out to me and I can tell you things that have worked well for us. There's a structure that has worked particularly well. If there's no structure, it goes downhill quickly. But anyway, that's one way to have the conversations. And what that does is people bring their friends. And so that increases the group size and the ideas and so on. And then my recommendation is that you bring up Palestine when there's intersectionality. So if there are other anti-racism efforts, for example, climate issues, there are issues of climate related to the occupation, anti-war efforts, obviously there's something related to that right now. So the point is to make it easy for those who want to talk about Palestine and Israel to do so. So it's like walking around with a sign on you saying, hey, I'm happy to talk about this with you. The other thing that's really important about that is the more I did that myself, the more I say it in a tone and with total comfort. And that's really jarring for some, because so many are, especially on the other side, are used to just the threat of the anti-Semitism argument silences folks. And if I'm out there just saying, oh yeah, I do Israel-Palestine activism and so on, that is really surprising to them, and I find it helpful because it shows them with my body language, with my tone, that I'm not fearful of that. And frankly, it's because I know it's baloney. I'm taking a position against racism. And so how could anti-racism be anti-Jewish? it doesn't make sense. So it's another one of those things that's illogical. I'm going to share this image. I don't know how big your screen is. You're trying to grow it. This is the image on the front of one of my books, and it's a house of cards. Can you all read what's on the cards? Great. So you see at the top is a Jewish state. You can see my hand, right?
Yeah.
And it's based on the story. And the story is that it's the only democracy in the Middle East, that Jews have and are continuously the victims, that Israel just wants peace and security, and that they're always on the defensive, and that the land was a land of no people for a people with no land, and that it was the promised land, and that they stand for equality, and that there's anti-Semitism, this whole emphasis and effort to persecute Jews. And so that's what this Jewish state is based on. That's what supports it. It's these stories. And the problem is there are these cards on the bottom as well. There's the right of return, which is the international legal right for Palestinians who were forced out or forced from their homes and not allowed to return. The fact that they're refugees. So the problem with this, the fact that there are refugees means it was not a land of no people, right? You can't have refugees if it was a land of no people.
That's why they
Right?
No.
You know, and they can't, and the right of return not being honored makes who the victim? Those whose right of return is being denied, right? And you can't be on the defensive if you're running an occupation, right? And so on. This, you can't want peace if you're putting Jewish only settlements on Palestinian land. That does not help the peace process. You can't be for equality if you've got an apartheid system. And so on. Again, you can't have a blockade. Who's the victim of the blockade, right? Not these guys. So the point is, these are the cards that the Zionist, the pro-Israel lobby does not want us talking about, because this whole house of cards collapses when these things are brought up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because the story no longer makes sense. So, so let me see if I can unzoom. There we go. So that's why I go back to, it's important when we have these conversations to ask them to explain the parts of their story that don't make sense. And I've just given you sort of a framework for the kinds of questions to ask based on these cards that are holding up this story. And once they, and you notice it doesn't take many facts, and most, if not all of those facts that I just shared are known by even our Zionist friends, right? So it's just showing them that it doesn't make sense. The story doesn't add up. And if we do it, again, in a loving way, they will ultimately be grateful for our care. And so the reality is, if we want to change the situation on the ground, if we want to bring peace to the region, the way to do it is through conversations and through awareness, in those conversations. So Ginny mentioned that some of my books, this book, have been available for sale, and I'm glad you all sold out. You can get them on Amazon or on my website, which is speakisrael.info. If you have any problems, just reach out to me through Ginny. I'm happy to organize, and I'm happy to do these kind of workshops if you have a group that's interested in these kind of conversations. So what this book does, and I'm just going to go into it at a high level, is it shares with you standard, what they call Hasbara messaging. Hasbara is sort of the propaganda for supporting Zionism in the state of Israel. And I assume you can read these, is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Are these phrases that you all have heard before?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'll just use one example of how I respond to this. And what this book does, here's the second set. And so I'll just share with you how the book, it's really a resource guide. The first book that I showed you, the cover with the cards, is a story of my conversion and what I learned along the way. It's my journey. This book is really a resource guide. I keep a copy handy so that when I get forgetful or emotional, then I can always refer back to it and it sort of grounds me. But what this book does is it takes these 18 basic messages, it divides them into, it has similar expressions for each of them, and then it gives you some related facts. The facts aren't that important, as I've mentioned before, but they're to provide you with some confidence that you're not, misleading anybody. And then what I do is I unpack the Israel language. So for example, on this one was, a balance. These are the assumptions. I took a propaganda workshop once. And one thing I learned from it is very interesting, is that the stories that we believe most strongly are the ones that we create. So the unspoken narrative is the strongest. And so if somebody says, so if we go back to this one, this view is not balanced, it's pro-Palestinian. The unspoken narrative is that balance is possible. That balance is what we want, right? In a very imbalanced situation, right? But it's not stated. It doesn't say we want balance, but these are sort of the unspoken assumptions that pass through our subconsciousness. So then I boil it down to the core issues. And then I go through a recommended approach. And then I'm just going to go through this so we can get to questions. And then I provide queries. This is a Quaker book, right? So we have to have queries. So, and again, and part of the reason for that is if it's not queries, it's statements, and that's accusatory and then telling them that they're wrong. So the question, so here is, so here's one, if you're accused of saying, hey, your view is not balanced, it's pro-Palestinian. So here are some potential queries here. If you all want to just read them. Okay. So that's what this book is about. And I go through for each of them. So I won't bore you with the more details here. So what to remember, we're the ones who have to change the situation by changing the narrative. We do that by building relationships and having conversations. And we have those conversations productively by asking clarifying questions. And then we highlight the incongruity and so on. And then you can get more info on the book there. And so my question for you is, who will you talk with? So the first is, make a list and figure out how you can make an impact. So I hope that was helpful.